You keep telling yourself that you have become ungrateful. You look at the life you once wanted, the people you once needed, the routines that once made you feel secure, and you cannot understand why they no longer reach you. Nothing is necessarily wrong with them. Nothing dramatic may have happened. Yet when you return to the places that used to feel like home, you feel as if you are visiting a set after the actors have gone. The furniture is familiar. The language is familiar. Even your old laughter is still available to you, but it arrives a second too late, as though you are remembering how to perform it. Carl Jung spent decades studying this kind of disconnection. He did not treat it as simple ingratitude, moodiness, or failure to appreciate the past. He saw it as a sign that the psyche had begun withdrawing energy from an identity that could no longer carry your development. That is the hidden message behind the distance you feel from your former life. You may believe you are losing your capacity to belong, but something more precise is happening. The personality you built to survive one chapter is no longer sufficient for the person trying to emerge in the next. Your disconnection is not merely from old circumstances. It is from the version of yourself that made those circumstances possible. This is why nostalgia has become so complicated. You can miss what was and still know you cannot return. You can love people and no longer feel known by them. You can remember a time when your days had shape, your place in the world seemed obvious, and your choices required less explanation. Yet the thought of living that way again creates a quiet pressure in your chest. You may call that pressure confusion. You may accuse yourself of restlessness. You may wonder whether you have ruined your own contentment by becoming too reflective, too sensitive, or too difficult to satisfy. But the psyche does not withdraw its deepest energy without reason. When an old life has finished teaching you what it can teach, the unconscious begins loosening your attachment to it. The loosening rarely feels noble. It often feels like boredom, numbness, irritation, fatigue, or distance. You stop replying with the same enthusiasm. You delay plans that once gave you comfort. You walk through familiar rooms and feel strangely absent from your own history. The hidden message is not that the past was false. The message is that your identification with it has become too small. Jung called the larger movement individuation. Individuation is not the project of becoming more unique for the sake of feeling special. It is the lifelong process through which you become less divided, less governed by roles you did not consciously choose, and more capable of living from the totality of your psyche. It requires a confrontation with everything your former identity excluded. That confrontation begins with a loss of enchantment. The old life once held your psychic energy because it matched what you needed to become at that time. A relationship may have taught you devotion. A career may have taught you competence. A community may have given you language, belonging, and protection. A family role may have taught you responsibility. None of this becomes meaningless simply because it no longer feels alive. But when the lesson has been absorbed, repetition begins to feel like confinement. A man sits in the car outside the house where he grew up. He has made the same drive every Sunday for years. His hand rests on the door handle, but he does not move. Through the window, he can see the familiar light above the dining table, and for several minutes he watches his family pass through the room without him. Nothing terrible waits inside. What frightens him is how quickly he will become his old self again once he enters. This is what remains unconscious when you describe your disconnection as a lack of gratitude. You are not only returning to old places, you are returning to old psychic agreements. You agree to speak less honestly. You agree to make your ambitions smaller. You agree to laugh at what no longer amuses you, hide what has changed, and keep the peace by presenting a recognizable face. Jung used the word persona for that recognizable face. The persona is the social identity that allows you to function in the world. It is necessary. It helps you become a reliable colleague, a good child, a devoted partner, a helpful friend, a stable member of a group. But every persona is selective. It reveals what a particular environment rewards and conceals what that environment cannot tolerate. Your former life may feel distant because its central persona has begun to collapse. You can keep wearing it, but you can no longer mistake it for your whole self. You notice the strain in your voice. You feel the exhaustion after conversations in which nothing openly harmful occurred. You become aware of how much energy is required to remain understandable to people who only know your previous form. The mask still fits your face, but it no longer fits your nervous system. The first truth is that disconnection often begins when your adaptation becomes more painful than your honesty. Jung saw neurosis not simply as a defect, but as a conflict between the life being lived and the life demanding recognition. The psyche produces symptoms when conscious identity refuses to change. What appears as unexplained distance may be the first protest against a pattern of adaptation that once protected you but now requires self-erasure. A woman opens a group chat and reads the same jokes she has answered for years. Her thumb hovers over the laughing symbol. She types a response, deletes it, and sets the phone face down. Later, she tells herself she is becoming antisocial. What she does not admit is that every exchange pulls her back into a version of herself who never says what she actually thinks. What you are calling coldness may be the psyche refusing to keep purchasing belonging with self-abandonment. This does not mean that every old relationship must end. It does mean that your previous way of participating cannot continue unchanged. The disconnection becomes sharper when the people around you depend on the old arrangement. They may not consciously want to limit you. They may simply feel safer when you occupy the place they understand. Your growth disturbs systems that were organized around your predictability. Jung understood that psychological development changes the balance of every relationship. When one person withdraws a projection, sets a boundary, or questions a role, the entire system must reorganize. This is why your internal shift may be met with confusion even when you have said very little. People often sense that they are losing access to a version of you before you have found words for what is changing. A son visits his parents after several months away. At dinner, his father tells a story that turns him into the careless child he used to be. Everyone laughs. He smiles automatically, then places his fork down and says, quietly, that the story is no longer funny to him. The room changes temperature, not because he has attacked anyone, but because he has interrupted the family's agreement about who he is allowed to be. Your discomfort is not proof that you are betraying the people who knew you first. It may be the emotional cost of refusing to remain psychologically frozen for their comfort. This is why the former life can feel almost magnetic and repellent at the same time. Part of you wants the old certainty back. Another part knows that certainty was purchased through unconsciousness. You did not have to ask who you were, because your environment answered for you. You did not have to choose your values because your group supplied them. You did not have to confront your unlived life because daily obligations kept you occupied. The loss of connection exposes the freedom you once said you wanted. Jung described the second half of life as a period when the values that built the outer personality begin to lose their authority. This does not occur at a fixed age. It can happen whenever the psyche has completed a major adaptation and begins demanding a more inward orientation. Achievement, approval, routine, and belonging may still matter, but they no longer answer the deepest question. A woman receives the promotion she worked toward for 6 years. Her colleagues bring cake. She smiles for photographs and thanks everyone by name. That evening, she sits on the edge of her bed without turning on the light. The email announcing her new title remains open on her phone, and she feels nothing but the terrifying realization that the goal had kept her from asking what she actually wanted. What you are experiencing is not necessarily a loss of motivation. It may be the collapse of motivation borrowed from a self you have outgrown. When this borrowed motivation disappears, you can feel profoundly disoriented. The old desires were clear because they belonged to a shared script. Work harder, become useful, be chosen, be admired, make them proud, stay agreeable, avoid conflict, build a life that can be explained in one sentence. These goals created movement, but movement is not the same as meaning. The psyche eventually asks whether your goals belong to you. That question is painful, because the answer may implicate years of your life. You may discover that you pursued security because uncertainty once felt dangerous. You may discover that you performed strength because vulnerability was punished. You may discover that you became needed because being needed felt safer than being loved. You may discover that your old life was built around avoiding an early wound. Jung's concept of the complex helps explain why former lives can hold such power. A complex is an emotionally charged pattern, organized around past experience. It does not merely live in memory. It shapes perception, behavior, and identity. You may believe you chose a role freely when in fact, the role offered relief from an old fear. A man becomes the person everyone calls in a crisis. He answers messages during dinner, cancels his own plans, and feels a secret pride in being indispensable. One night, he watches the phone ring and does not pick it up. The silence that follows is not peaceful. It is filled with the childhood terror that if he is not useful, he may no longer matter. Your distance from the life where you were always needed may be the beginning of learning that your worth does not have to be earned through exhaustion. This is why returning to your former life can trigger guilt. Guilt is not always evidence that you have done something wrong. Sometimes it is the emotional alarm that sounds when you violate an internalized rule. If the rule says that love requires compliance, then honesty will feel cruel. If the rule says that loyalty requires sameness, then growth will feel like betrayal. If the rule says that safety depends on approval, then self-definition will feel dangerous. The guilt may be old obedience trying to survive. Jung insisted that individuation requires differentiation from the collective. Differentiation does not mean isolation or superiority. It means learning where the group ends and your own psyche begins. Without that separation, you cannot offer genuine relationship. You can only offer adaptation. A woman visits old friends for a weekend. They spend hours recalling stories from a period she barely recognizes as her own. Each time she tries to speak about what matters to her now, the conversation slides back toward who she used to date, how reckless she used to be, how much fun she used to make of everything. On the train home, she cries without knowing exactly why. She is grieving the fact that their affection is real, but much of it is attached to someone she can no longer perform. The grief you feel does not mean the bond was false. It means love cannot prevent time from changing the form in which two people can meet. This grief deserves precision. You are not only grieving people, places, and routines. You are grieving continuity. You once believed your life would unfold as a coherent extension of who you had already been. You expected to carry the same preferences, loyalties, and ambitions forward. You thought growth would add to you without taking anything away. But psychological growth is selective. It preserves what is living and dismantles what has become defensive. Jung used images of death and rebirth because transformation often feels like the loss of a known identity before the arrival of a new one. The unconscious does not hand you a complete replacement. It removes your certainty first. This creates the liminal period in which you are no longer who you were, but not yet able to name who you are becoming. A man clears out a desk after leaving a profession that shaped his adult life. He places awards in a box, then removes one and sets it back on the shelf. 10 minutes later, he puts it in the box again. He keeps the old identification card in his wallet for months, even though it no longer opens any door. He is not indecisive. He is learning how slowly identity leaves the body. What you are calling emptiness may be the unoccupied space between an expired identity and a more truthful one. This in-between period is where many people panic and return too quickly. They mistake familiarity for guidance. They revive old relationships, old habits, or old ambitions because uncertainty feels unbearable. The former life offers immediate relief because it tells you who to be. It gives you lines to speak and expectations to meet. But relief can be regressive when it restores a structure that your psyche has already outgrown. Jung described regression as a backward movement of psychic energy. Yet he also recognized that regression can serve transformation when it allows unconscious material to emerge. The danger is not in remembering or revisiting the past. The danger is in confusing contact with the past for a command to rebuild it exactly as it was. A woman returns to the neighborhood where she spent her 20s. She walks past the cafe where she once wrote every morning. For a moment, she considers moving back, imagining that the old streets might restore her lost sense of direction. Then she notices what she actually misses. Not the apartment, not the job, not even the people, but the version of herself who still believed her future was unlimited. Your longing for the former life may be longing for a feeling that the former life cannot give you again. This distinction changes everything. You may not want the old relationship. You may want the innocence you had before it disappointed you. You may not want the old career. You may want the confidence you felt when your path seemed obvious. You may not want the old community. You may want the ease of being recognized without having to explain your transformation. The past becomes dangerous when you ask it to return a psychological state that only existed because you had not yet learned what you know now. The shadow becomes especially important here. Your former life was built not only from what you expressed, but from what you excluded. Every identity creates a shadow containing qualities that threaten its stability. The responsible person may exile spontaneity. The peaceful person may exile anger. The achiever may exile need. The loyal person may exile dissent. The spiritual person may exile ambition, envy, and bodily desire. When your old life loses its hold, shadow qualities begin seeking expression. Jung did not believe the shadow was merely evil or shameful. He saw it as a repository of unlived energy. Much of what feels disruptive during transformation is not pathology. It is rejected vitality, returning in forms you do not yet know how to use. A woman known for patience begins feeling sudden irritation during family conversations. She grips her glass more tightly when someone interrupts her. In the bathroom, she studies her face in the mirror and whispers that she is becoming a terrible person. What she cannot yet see is that the anger is carrying information her politeness suppressed for years. Your anger at what once felt normal may be the return of a boundary that your former identity could not afford to possess. This does not mean every impulse should be acted upon. Integration is not indulgence. The shadow must be listened to, translated, and given a conscious form. Anger may need to become speech. Envy may reveal an unlived desire. Fatigue may expose a role maintained by fear. Restlessness may point toward a neglected capacity. The task is not to obey the feeling blindly, but to understand what psychic fact it is trying to restore. Your disconnection is often the first clearing in which these facts can be heard. Old environments make old responses automatic. The body remembers where to shrink. The voice remembers which words to soften. The face remembers which expression prevents questions. This is why you can feel transformed in one place and strangely reduced in another. The psyche is not inconsistent. It is responding to a field of expectations that has been rehearsed over time. Jung's work on projection shows how relationships become organized around unconscious images. Others do not only encounter you as you are, they encounter their image of you. You do the same to them. When you change, the projection no longer fits, and both people may experience the gap as loss. A man tells an old friend that he no longer wants to spend every conversation mocking their lives. The friend laughs and asks when he became so serious. He tries to explain, then stops. For the rest of the evening, they speak politely about ordinary things. Both leave feeling that the other has changed, though what has really changed is the shared defense that once kept deeper questions away. Your loneliness may come from losing a mutual illusion before you have developed a more honest form of closeness. This is one of the hardest parts of leaving a former life psychologically. You may have relationships that functioned through shared avoidance. You bonded over constant activity, so no one had to feel grief. You bonded over criticism, so no one had to admit envy. You bonded over chaos, so no one had to face stillness. You bonded over being needed, so no one had to risk being known. When one person stops participating in the defense, the bond can feel threatened. That does not make the relationship worthless. It reveals what must change if the relationship is to survive your consciousness. Some bonds deepen when the old pattern is named. Others become brittle. Some people meet you in the present. Others keep summoning your former self because that is the only version with whom they know how to relate. The hidden message in your disconnection is becoming clearer. Your psyche is asking for relationships that can tolerate reality. Yet there is a deeper cost you may still be avoiding. You may be willing to admit that your former life no longer fits, but you may still expect the next life to arrive without requiring you to disappoint anyone. You may hope for a transformation that preserves every attachment, every approval, every image of you, and every form of security. You want to become more truthful while remaining entirely recognizable. That bargain is rarely available. Individuation has a social cost because every authentic choice closes certain possibilities. To say yes to one direction is to stop feeding another. To speak honestly is to surrender control over how others interpret you. To outgrow a role is to lose the rewards that came with performing it. To stop being endlessly available may mean that some people call you selfish. To refuse an inherited path may mean that those who sacrificed for it feel rejected. You cannot choose your deepest life and remain innocent of consequence. This is the shadow beneath the shadow. You may not be afraid of change itself. You may be afraid of becoming the person who causes change in other people. You may fear the sadness in someone's face when you say you are not coming back. You may fear the silence after you name what has been unspoken. You may fear that your growth will reveal how much of the old harmony depended on your compliance. Jung knew that becoming conscious does not make you harmless. It makes you responsible. Responsibility is not the same as preserving everyone's comfort. It means recognizing the impact of your choices without using that impact as an excuse to remain false. You do not earn integrity by avoiding all pain. Sometimes you create pain by leaving. Sometimes you create deeper pain by staying while your spirit withdraws. A man keeps visiting a friend every week, though their conversations have become mechanical. He nods, smiles, and leaves early with another excuse. The friend senses the distance and tries harder to recreate their old closeness. Neither speaks directly, so the relationship becomes a long performance of loyalty in which both feel abandoned. Your refusal to choose can become its own form of cruelty when it forces others to live inside a reality you already know is ending. This is why the disconnection cannot remain only a private feeling. Eventually it asks something of you. Not a dramatic announcement, not a reckless destruction of your life, but an honest recognition that your inner withdrawal has consequences for how you speak, commit, promise, and stay. The cost may be misunderstanding. You may explain yourself carefully and still be misread. You may speak with compassion and still be called distant. You may leave without accusation and still become the villain in someone else's story. The fantasy that perfect communication can prevent all hurt is another way the ego postpones transformation. Sometimes there are no words that make your change painless to the people who preferred your old form. If you can make the past entirely bad, departure becomes simple. If you can diagnose everyone who does not understand you, you can avoid mourning. If you can declare yourself awakened and them unconscious, you can preserve superiority instead of facing loss. But Jung's psychology offers no permission for that inflation. Individuation does not place you above the people you leave. It places you in a more demanding relationship with your own truth. You are not being asked to prove that your new life is better. You are being asked to stop using your former life as the standard by which every new feeling is judged. The new phase may feel less exciting, less certain, and less socially rewarded. It may not provide immediate evidence that you made the right choice. You may spend months in a quiet psychological winter, where nothing seems to replace what has ended. This is where you are most likely to misread the message. The absence of a new identity does not mean the old one is still alive. The lack of certainty does not mean you should reverse course. The loneliness of transition does not prove you were wrong to change. It means the psyche is no longer willing to offer borrowed answers. You are allowed to stop forcing affection for a life that has completed its work. You are allowed to stop performing nostalgia because others find your change uncomfortable. You are allowed to remember with tenderness without treating memory as obligation. You are allowed to recognize that some relationships belonged to a specific version of you, and that honoring them does not require preserving them in their original form. You are also allowed to move slowly. Psychological separation does not always require physical departure. Sometimes the most meaningful change is internal. You stop seeking permission. You stop explaining every preference. You stop offering your nervous system as proof of love. You enter the old room without becoming the old person. Jung understood integration as the capacity to include what has been learned without remaining possessed by it. Your former life does not have to be rejected. It has to be placed in proportion. It becomes part of your story rather than the authority over your future. The people you were are not enemies. They carried you through realities your current self may not have survived. The agreeable self protected attachment. The ambitious self created momentum. The responsible self built stability. The detached self prevented overwhelm. The version of you that now feels foreign may once have been an intelligent answer to a real condition. You do not heal by humiliating who you had to become. You heal by allowing that identity to retire from a job it no longer needs to perform. You can thank the mask without putting it back on. You can respect the role without accepting another lifetime contract. You can let the old self belong to you without allowing it to govern you. This is the reframe you have been resisting. Your disconnection from your former life is not evidence that you have lost your way. It is evidence that your psyche has stopped confusing familiarity with truth. The distance is not asking you to erase the past. It is asking you to meet it consciously, to take what is living, grieve what is finished, and refuse what requires your disappearance. You were never meant to feel at home in every version of your life forever. A home that served your becoming can become a room you must eventually leave. The hidden message behind your disconnection is not "go back and feel grateful." It is "stop demanding that the person you are becoming fit inside the life that created the person you were." If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you explore Jung's psychology for the parts of your life that ordinary explanations cannot reach. Watch the video on your screen now to understand what happens when your old identity dissolves before the new one has formed.